Shabbat Shalom! It is Friday once again, and this time we have reached the Parashat of Re'eh. In this Parashat there's a lot going on, but there's one topic that comes up time and time again, and I think it's something worth thinking about together. Everyone, I would say, who speaks English knows a word which has now worked its way into general culture, which is the word kosher. Something is kosher or not kosher obviously means something in Jewish religious practices, but even in the regular world, thanks to Jewish culture seeping into general, especially American traditions, people will discuss, oh my goodness, I don't know if we can do that, that's not exactly kosher, whether it's regarding money or regarding laws or stuff like that. But if we actually take a closer look at the Jewish practice of kosher, where it actually originates, we will discover something very interesting. If you take the concept of kashrut and you break it down, there are three main realms that kashrut applies to. Obviously, I'm not talking about Pesach, that's a whole different story, but kashrut usually really applies to three main realms, and I'm sure there are probably more, you could find others, but these are the main ones. The first one is obviously the distinction between meat and milk. And I think this probably keeps most Jewish kitchens busy, which is that a meaty knife? Is that a milchik knife? Is that a frying pan that has been used to cook meat? Is that a frying pan that's been used to cook onions? And the relation between the milchik and the fleishik and the parav and all the different stages in between. That is one area of kashrut, and that, by the way, among many sources in the Torah, starts from our parasha as well. Lo tevashel gdi bechalev imo. You should not cook a baby goat in its mother's milk. That is the origin of the halachot of basar bechalav, of meat and milk together. But that's not the only realm of kashrut. Another realm of kashrut, which I think is probably the most famous realm, which most people, even if they're not necessarily very observant, will still keep, is what kind of animals do you eat? Most Jews around the world will prefer not to eat pork, will prefer not to eat shrimps or whatever it is. Why? Because, as we see in our parasha, also echoing a Parashat Shmini in Sefer Vayikra, there is a list of kosher animals and non-kosher animals. You cannot eat pork, you cannot eat rabbit, you cannot eat all sorts of creepy crawlies, and you can eat chicken, or chicken's a whole different question, but you can eat birds, you can eat cows and goats and stuff like that. And the parasha actually goes into great detail regarding the different animals that you can eat and that you can't eat. So that's another whole realm, especially regarding fish, if it has fins and scales and so on and so forth. That's another realm of kashrut. But the third realm of kashrut, which I was surprised to find when I was learning for my Rabbinate exam, that most of the discussions around kashrut actually are on a third realm that most people aren't really aware of much these days at all, and that is the realm of blood. Also, the realm of kashering, one of the sources that we get the word kosher from. Kashering is to try and remove blood from meat. When one kills an animal, obviously the steak that exists within the cow is full of meat, full of meat and blood, and all sorts of other elements as well, fats and stuff that you need to take off, chelev and the like. But whenever one would buy meat in the butcher, back in the day, going back even only 100 or 200 years, you would have to bring the meat home and you would have to put it through a process called kashering, which involves putting on salt and letting the blood drain, and in some cases roasting the meat and so on and so forth, to try and get the blood out of the meat. Now today, we go to the supermarket, we go to the butcher, we can even order stuff online, and it comes to us all koshered, which is where you get the word kosher from. It's already been dealt with from a kashrut perspective. All of the blood that is not allowed has been removed. It's already been gone through all the processes. You don't have to do it at home. I'm sure if you ask your grandparents, And probably if you ask, even if you have very young grandparents, I'm sure they would remember their grandparents who would probably have to do this kind of stuff at home. They had a special board with holes in it that were at a certain angle, that the blood would drip out, and they'd be able to do this kind of stuff. Especially if you start from scratch, you shecht an animal, you do ritual slaughter, you have to do all of the processes that follow afterwards. That is something that today we've kind of forgotten about. But it's something very important in the world of kashrut. That also stems from our parasha. And it stems from the pasuk, Rak chazak echol hadam ki hadam levilti echol hadam ki hadam hu hanefesh. Do not eat blood when cooking meat, because hadam hu hanefesh. The blood is the nefesh, the soul. As it continues, do not eat the soul with the meat. Now, I am not a Kabbalist. I do not understand all of the different elements of the soul. The Kabbalists go into the different elements. There's neshama, there's nefesh, there's chaya, there's yichidah. There's all sorts of different elements that make up the different parts of the Jewish soul, of an animal's soul, of all sorts of different types of souls. But one thing is for sure. There is something about the lifeblood, even in English we use the term lifeblood, of an animal that needs to be respected, that needs to be left alone. Even when it comes to eating meat, which is in many ways one of the main focuses of kashrut, there are rules and regulations. We're not able to just randomly grab, an animal and just chew. That's not something that we do. Before we approach our food, we have to think carefully about the morality involved. And the Rav Avram Yitzchak Cohen Cook, the famous Rav Cook, already set the ground, prepared the ground for the ideas of a future perspective on vegetarianism. And he proposes potentially that in the end of days, when we come later on in history, when we move towards a higher state of living, a higher state of being, our relationship with animals will change, and as such there is a chance that we will move towards a plane of vegetarianism, not necessarily because we will treat animals like people, but because animals themselves will reach a higher level of existence. And that's again delving into Kabbalistic understandings. But the concept of recognizing that meat is not something to be taken for granted. Meat, as the famous and infamous phrase goes, meat can be murder. Meat is murder if you don't know what you're doing. And when it comes to kashrut, going back all the way to Har Sinai, going all the way back to Moshe Rabbeinu, this concept of, meat is not simple. You have to know what you're doing. Kashrut is there in order to make us recognize the complexity of life and death, both in the animal world and in our own world. To recognize that hadam hanefesh, blood is part of life. Blood is part of the next generation. By the way, blood is incredibly fertile. If you pour blood on the ground, one of the instructions here is do not drink the blood, but rather pour it on the ground. And then the blood will seep into the ground, and that will itself bring forth new life. The idea that the blood is part of the circle of life, right? And it feeds us all. And that is part of how we have to approach kashrut. So next time you walk into a kitchen and you see meat and milk, and you see different types of meat, and you see a stamp saying kosher, or you walk past a restaurant and it says kosher, I think it's important that we recognize a very important, deeper level of understanding what is kosher all about. Kosher is all about having a deeper relationship with Hashem, with the world, with His creation, through these rules and regulations that allow us to recognize the moral imperative when it comes to eating, when it comes to meat, when it comes to an animal giving its life. For us, what does that mean? What does that mean in the future? Does an animal have a soul? Is it in the blood? What does that mean? How do we approach that? These are all thoughts that should be cascading through our mind next time we're about to bite into a hamburger. So I wish us all a Shabbat Shalom. I wish us all a week of introspection, of understanding, of recognizing that nothing is stam, as they would say in Hebrew. Nothing is just random. Everything has its own specific place, especially in halacha, especially in Jewish law. It's a very complex system that is there in order to bring us to a higher level of thought and intellectual activity. And Be'ezrat Hashem, may we all have an amazing, amazing week. Shabbat Shalom.